Madam President, I rise to express my support for the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, the only measure now before us that will prevent President Obama from having a free and independent hand to conclude a flawed agreement with the government of Iran. The White House and the Ayatollahs in Iran must know that the United States Congress will not tolerate a bad deal secretly struck behind our backs and without our approval. This bill, the Corker-Menendez bill, now being managed by Senator Corker and Senator Cardin, on the floor, this bill before us, needs our engagement and is the only vehicle we have to send that message. Thus, the passage of the Review Act is absolutely essential. Its passage will send a message more important than any amendments, no matter how correct or well-conceived, if those amendments would doom the bill, mute the message, and deprive us of this vital role. We have come to a moment of decision in this chamber. It is clear at last that we are finally close to imposing a vital congressional role in evaluating any deal, something President Obama previously had been determined to avoid. I have long been concerned that the President is determined to implement his version of a deal with Iran on his own, circumventing the Congress. This is not acceptable. Resolving this issue with Iran is the most significant foreign policy and security challenge of our age. It cannot be pursued simply by the President, potentially overreaching his constitutional authority, longing for a legacy and desperate for a deal. If he fears that a supermajority in Congress would reject this deal, if it is presented to us, then he has struck the wrong deal. Fortunately, the right statesman-like presidential support was finally provided after the Foreign Relations Committee voted on an entirely bipartisan basis to give Congress a role in this matter. The question is whether the President will accept the decision made by the Congress as to whether the agreement with Iran achieves the goal of denying Iranian nuclear weapons capability. The successful congressional strategy that brought us to that result in committee required the sponsors of this bill, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, to keep the focus on its core purpose. And while there were many amendments considered or offered in the committee that could have improved the bill, the Corker-Menendez bill passed by the Foreign Relations Committee is a necessary first step in achieving the goal of congressional engagement in one of, if not the most important issues of our time. It is now clear that the most important goal at this stage of this misguided and badly managed negotiations with the Iranian regime is that Congress must have a determining voice in accepting or rejecting any deal that is presented to us. With passage of the Corker-Menendez legislation, we will be able to spell out with precision what sort of an Iran deal might be acceptable, what concessions may be going too far, and what the consequences would be if Iran backs away from acceptable conditions. I want to emphasize and define the worst possible outcome that could happen. In our effort to impose a congressional rule, if that fails, if this bill is defeated or the promised veto is upheld, Congress will have become a spent force. Iran will see that Congress is no longer a matter of concern for them. The Iranians will have a green light to continue negotiations with a weak administration desperate for a deal, any deal. The Iranians can play their hand to maximum advantage without concern for the views of Congress nor even the views of the American people that we represent. At the same time, the administration would be free to give as much ground as necessary to secure a deal that apparently they so desperately desire. They will be constrained by nothing coming from this chamber or an impotent Congress. To avoid that outcome, we must focus on keeping the bipartisan majority on this bill solid and robust. So I am co-sponsoring, supporting, and will be voting for the Corker-Menendez bill. This is a necessary, immediate step, as I have said, toward a much more crucial vote on the Iran deal itself, where our focus needs to be. Once we've secured a congressional role by passing this bill, we then must use the next 2 months to analyze the outline agreement that came out of the negotiations in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago, identify its weaknesses, and determine how we should best proceed. As it now stands, as outlined by the so-called political framework, I am profoundly unhappy with what has been agreed to by this administration. If this is what we see when the result of the final negotiations are presented to us, I will vote against it and do my best to make sure others do as well. We in Congress must make sure that the White House knows that we require if a deal is to be accepted. This is not a recent or uninformed position on my part. I have been deeply involved in this issue for the past several years, and I have been concerned about the growing threat of Iran since at least 2001. Back then, when I was ambassador in Berlin, the embassy's biggest challenge was to persuade Germany to support the invasion of Iraq. But the Israeli ambassador to Germany at the time, Shimon Stein, kept talking to me about what they conceived to be the real ultimate threat. That threat, and he convinced me that an even greater threat would be coming from Iran, and that this threat would continue to grow until we took it seriously and dealt with it effectively. After returning to the United States, I co-chaired with Senator Chuck Robb the original Iran project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We focused deeply on the Iran nuclear issue and offered detailed analysis and recommendations on how we believed it should be dealt with. Our task force members included such experts as Ash Carter, now Secretary of Defense, Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of the key and most experienced ambassadors and foreign policy analysts, particularly in the Middle East, a number of key generals who had served with the military on Middle Eastern affairs, and a number of other names, including Jack Keane and others. And our reports covered all the elements of a deal that is acceptable and could best meet, we thought, our national security needs. These included all aspects of fissile material production and how that activity must be limited and controlled, activities at the various nuclear facilities and the type of research and development that must be curtailed, the issue of uranium stockpiles and their disposition, nuclear weapons design activities in the past that need to be revealed and stopped, missile development work, the critical need of adequate inspection regimes and compliance verification measures, and importantly, the duration of any future deal. We also examined the requirements of a necessary and credible military option that must back up any diplomatic efforts and sanctions pressure to achieve the right result. It was a last resort, and it was there to apply the pressure needed, along with ever-ratcheting sanctions, if Iran continued to defy the wishes of the United Nations, the wishes of the United States, the wishes of the free world, and all those who had spoken up about the consequences, the deadly consequences of the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons. Since that early involvement and throughout that period, I've supported negotiations as one of the essential tools to solve this problem. I want to state that again. This is not a rush to war. This is doing everything we can to prevent a war, to prevent a conflict. And I have supported ardently negotiations to try to achieve the necessary result, combined with sanctions, putting ever-increasing pressure on the Iranian regime to achieve the desired result, with the backup not taking off the table the use of force if necessary, but only if necessary, only if everything else failed, because 4 presidents, including our current president, have stated that Iranian possession of nuclear weapons is simply unacceptable. The United Nations has passed numerous resolutions to that effect. Other nations have said the same thing. And yet now we are looking at something that might allow Iran to break all of those commitments that it had made and all of those assertions that we have made. We need a solution that guarantees our security and ensures that Iran will never have nuclear weapons. If the White House cannot be persuaded to bring us a deal that does that, they should not bring us a deal at all. Unfortunately, it is clear to me from the framework agreement and subsequent developments that these negotiations are off track and have been for some time. They do not begin to meet the minimum criteria outlined in our several bipartisan policy centers reports. Let me name 5 major problems that I see currently with the framework proposal that has been agreed to. First, the Obama administration's negotiating tactics have been seriously flawed from the beginning, abandoning central principles at the very outset of the negotiations. An agreement that builds on the outline emerging from the negotiations and trumped by the administration as a breakthrough will allow Iran to retain a robust industrial capacity ability to enrich uranium, the core of nuclear weapons. This was never the intention of the international community until the Obama administration negotiators took the helm and changed direction. The original intent to deprive Iran from this nuclear weapons infrastructure was deemed to be, quote, just too hard to achieve. The result is that Iran can now assume a guarantee that it will have the right to enrich uranium, the regime's fundamental demand from the beginning, and one in which the United Nations Security Council has firmly and consistently refused until this administration began these negotiations. In the wake of that fundamental concession, we will have to rely on elaborate monitoring and compliance verification mechanisms to keep the uranium enrichment enterprise within agreed bounds. That directly leads to my second major problem with the outline agreement. On the surface, there's a lot of reassurance that we would be able to detect cheating, and the President has emphasized this point repeatedly. Well, I've seen all this before. I served here in this Senate when we were told our agreements with North Korea could be verified and would lead to a safer world. We were misled by that illusion. Today, 20 years after the nuclear agreement with North Korea, negotiated by the Clinton administration, that country now has an estimated 20 nuclear warheads, and the Chinese experts tell us that the North Koreans will have more than 40 by the end of next year, and an effective ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, to put those weapons on. All that work, after developing such a huge, dangerous nuclear arsenal, was done after we concluded a negotiated agreement to end North Korea's nuclear program, confident that we would be able to detect cheating. Let me repeat that. All that North Korea has achieved in violation of the agreement that we made with them has occurred after that agreement, not before. And today, they sit as a dangerous nuclear-armed nation with over 20 nuclear warheads that can be easily and have been attached to ICBMs. Now I fear we're making the same mistake in negotiating with another rogue regime. In recent days, it's become difficult for anyone to maintain that the agreement under consideration by this administration with Iran will provide the transparency that we need. Senior Iranian officials and authorities, including the Ayatollah himself and the chief of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, have said repeatedly that there will be no international inspections of Iranian military facilities. And we know that much of the nefarious nuclear weapons development work has gone on in such facilities, and barring access to them must simply be the end of any deal, if that holds. The White House has indicated that such hardline statements by the regime are part of their negotiating tactics. I don't take comfort from that. If that's so, then it must be proven at the negotiating table, not simply by declarations from our White House. If the administration brings us a deal that does not include complete transparency and total ability to monitor Iranian compliance anywhere in the country, then all members of Congress must stand up and reject it. Thirdly, I find there are many other nearly sinister details buried within this outline that are hidden from those not steeped in the technical details of this entire matter. Many show that our negotiators caved on key issues, some at the last minute, to prevent Iran from walking out. In fact, the entire negotiations process since it began 6 years ago has been a steady, uninterrupted litany of concessions as we give ground on one issue after another. The outline agreement confirms that pattern and hints at more to come. One of the many examples of this agreement is the agreement to allow continuing research and development of the most advanced centrifuges within the Fordow site that is safely buried deep beneath the mountain. Because there will not be uranium enriched there for the first 10 years of the agreement, we're told to take comfort. In fact, the developments that will occur in that sheltered bunker will make a nuclear breakout capability certain and rapid once the agreement expires in a decade. Even President Obama recently admitted that in the final years of the period covered by the outline, quote, I quote, "the breakout time would have shrunk almost to zero." That startling omission is a mortal blow to this agreement, in my view, and it comes from the chief advocate of the deal. A fourth problem with the outline is the essential issue of sanctions relief. Initially, after the outline was released, the White House fact sheet emphasized that sanctions would be lifted gradually in stages as the Iranians showed a pattern of compliance with the terms of an agreement. The Iranian negotiators and the supreme leader immediately refuted that claim. They continue to say there is no such agreement and that all sanctions must be lifted immediately upon signing. It remains for them a non-negotiable demand. President Obama responded in a press conference last week that all of a sudden he was not very concerned about the phasing or timing issue or the way sanctions would be lifted. Instead, he said, and again I quote, "the so-called snapback provisions that would reimpose sanctions in the event of noncompliance were more important." These presidential comments signaled publicly that once again the Ayatollah has had his way. Sadly, no one seriously gives any credibility to these alleged snapback provisions and their efficacy once the sanctions dam has burst. Fifth, another mortal flaw in the outline is the issue of expiration dates, the sunset clauses. The outline in the White House talking points designed to sell it confuse this issue. Various time frames have been mentioned: 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, permanent. The fact is that the core limitations on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, if they are actually implemented over time, expire in 10 years, others in 15. The sanctions against Iran will have long since disappeared, and Iran will then have the technical ability, the will, and the wealth to sprint toward a nuclear arsenal, as the President has acknowledged. 10 years, or even 15 years, is tomorrow afternoon in this dangerous game for the world's future. Again, the President, in his own words, tell us everything we need to know about the effectiveness of the deal he is pressing on us. And I quote again, what is a more relevant fear would be that in year 13, 14, 15, they have advanced centrifuges that enrich uranium fairly rapidly. And at that point, the breakout times would have shrunk almost down to zero. This is indeed the most relevant fear presented by the negotiations with the Iranian regime, namely the fear that Iran will be given the path to nuclear weapons possession, resulting in consequences that are not acceptable. We should all agree with President Obama that That is indeed the most relevant fear presented by his negotiations with the Iranian regime. But at this moment, it seems most probable that we will be called upon to consider a deeply flawed agreement, one that is worse than no agreement at all. But this is not entirely unavoidable. We still have time to press the negotiators on both sides to change the outcome of their talks. The Iranians must know that with passage of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, Congress has become an important player at the table. There will be no new constraints on their maximalist positions. If they want a deal now, they must give ground. If not, they will face new, more painful, and more relentless sanctions pressure. Mr. President, this is a profound moment in our history. A nuclear-armed Iran would present a danger to the Middle East, to the United States, and to the world that is impossible to overstate. Preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons has always been at the heart of our nuclear strategy. More than that, it is at the heart of the future of the world. Allowing Iran to develop the capacity to develop those weapons, igniting thereby a nuclear arms race among its neighbors and beyond, must be prevented at any cost. There is nothing whatsoever partisan about this request. Neither I nor most of my Republican colleagues are attacking the President or trying to deny him a foreign policy triumph or wishing him ill in this important task. Similarly, I trust our Democrat colleagues will not be blindly supporting the President on this issue, no matter what agreement might emerge from the Iran negotiations. In many ways, the future of these negotiations is now in our hands. We must pass the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act with as much bipartisan support as we can achieve in order to play a significant or any role in this process. We must not provoke a veto that can be sustained, thereby depriving Congress of our role and voice. We must all use the next 2 months to press the White House to demand an agreement that permanently halts Iran's nuclear ambitions. We must then evaluate objectively and honestly the agreement that emerges, accept it if we can, reject it if we must. This is a solemn duty that the Constitution requires of the United States Senate, and I trust that each of us will be up to the task and the challenge that we are facing. Madam President, I yield the floor.